Buenos días a todos los que nos ven desde América y buenas tardes a los que lo hacen desde Europa. Mi nombre es Vicente Pérez, soy el director de la UNED-México y es para mí un verdadero honor darles a todos la bienvenida a esta octava edición del Seminario Internacional sobre Comportamiento y Aplicaciones, el SINCA 2021. Me acompañan en este breve acto de inauguración el doctor Berto Martínez, la doctora Marget Rojas, de la Universidad de Guadalajara, y el doctor Everardo Camacho del ITESO, de Guadalajara, representando todos a las instituciones que han estado apoyando la organización de este congreso. A ellas habría que sumar, entre otras, a la Universidad Autónoma de Tlaxcala, la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, la UNAM, la Universidad Nacional de Educación a Distancia de España y, por supuesto, también a la propia UNED-México. Porque esta edición del Congreso, como ya saben, está cargada de novedades respecto a ediciones anteriores. Una de estas novedades es la incorporación a la organización de una universidad no mexicana, como es la UNED, aunque sea a través de su centro asociado en México. Pero, sin lugar a dudas, la principal novedad es el propio formato, muy acorde con la propia UNED, por otra parte, el formato online, un congreso a distancia. Cuando a principios de este año nos reunimos el comité organizador para tomar decisiones sobre la organización del octavo SINCA, llegamos a la conclusión de que si no queríamos retrasar al menos un año la celebración del Congreso, teníamos que optar por la modalidad online. He de reconocer, y creo que hablo por todos, que nadie estaba satisfecho del todo con esta decisión, aunque la considerásemos inevitable. De hecho, todos coincidíamos en que los congresos, y desde luego en especial el SINCA, no solo son puntos de comunicación y debate académico, sino también una inmejorable forma de generar redes sociales y de colaboración. Y obviamente sentíamos que con este formato íbamos a sacrificar muchos de los rasgos que definen el carácter del SINCA. No obstante, y a pesar de este convencimiento, creímos que los inconvenientes de pasar un año más sin SINCA, de hecho, superaban con creces esas limitaciones. Así que nos propusimos cumplir un doble objetivo. Por un lado, intentar emular al máximo las características de un congreso presencial y, por otro, aprovechar esta circunstancia sobrevenida, en gran medida, para convertirla en una oportunidad. Respecto a este primer objetivo, como saben, en estos 2 años se han celebrado muchos congresos online con diferentes estilos y formatos. En este SINCA Online hemos apostado por la retransmisión en vivo y por generar espacios de debate. Es por esto que, aunque hemos dejado la oportunidad de ofrecer materiales asíncronos, tanto póster como comunicaciones, todos disponen de un espacio en directo para realizar y responder las preguntas de los asistentes. Y respecto al segundo objetivo, hemos aprovechado esta oportunidad para, por un lado, llegar a más interesados en el análisis de la conducta, con un congreso gratuito, público y con horarios accesibles para toda América y Europa. Pero también, por otro lado, no solo no hemos reducido la calidad y cantidad de la oferta, sino que se ha aumentado, pudiendo incorporar a profesionales de primer nivel que, debido a su ubicación, hubiese sido muy complejo contar con su participación. Bien, en definitiva, la planificación ha sido muy compleja y hemos optado por correr muchos riesgos en pro de la calidad de la oferta. Desde ahora le pedimos disculpas y comprensión si se produce algún fallo técnico u organizativo, pero creemos que ha valido la pena para llegar hasta aquí. Bien, voy terminando ya mi intervención, pero no sin antes agradecer a todos los miembros del comité organizador que tanto esfuerzo le llevan dedicando a este proyecto desde hace meses. A los presentes Héctor, Marget y Everardo, por supuesto, pero también a Ivette, a Idania, a Luis, a Josué y a Felipe. Muchísimas gracias al ITESO, desde luego, por cedernos la infraestructura necesaria para producir estas retransmisiones en vivo, a la UNED por la financiación que también lo hace posible, tanto la organización del Congreso como la posterior publicación del libro, y desde luego a los estudiantes que están ayudando con esta producción, Alejandro, Michelle, Mariana, Juan Pablo, Lucía, Alan, Bárbara, Laura y Diego, y desde luego a los estudiantes de Tlaxcala que también nos han ayudado con los carteles. Muchísimas gracias a todos. Disfruten de su congreso y les cedo ya la palabra al doctor Camacho.
Muchas gracias. Muy buenos días a todos. Pues a mí no me queda más que darles la bienvenida a este congreso. Como ustedes saben, hace 2 años tuvimos la gran oportunidad de ser sede presencial de este congreso y la experiencia que tuvimos hace 2 años fue tan gratificante en términos de la oportunidad de formación de nuestros estudiantes para tener acceso de manera complementaria y no menos importante, a contenidos de primer nivel, tanto de investigación básica como de investigación aplicada, a conferencistas de calidad de distintos lugares del país y extranjeros. Y bueno, en esta ocasión nos toca ser también un poco anfitriones, pero a distancia, de este evento. Nos da mucho gusto ver que la comunidad SINCA ha ido creciendo. Tenemos un crecimiento importante en trabajos y quisiera decir que no solamente es el crecimiento en un nivel cuantitativo, sino también cualitativo. Consideramos que tenemos un programa de mucha calidad, muy bien balanceado, tanto en la dimensión de la investigación básica y la investigación aplicada, como el SINCA ha apostado desde sus orígenes. Por todas estas razones, estamos muy contentos el día de hoy que iniciamos este congreso. Sabemos que va a ser una gran experiencia de aprendizaje para todos los participantes y quiero agradecer la colaboración y el compromiso para todos, porque entre todos hemos estado construyendo de una manera comunitaria este evento académico que es de todos. Muchas gracias y que tengamos todos un buen congreso. Felicidades. Paso ahora las palabras a la doctora María Rojas.
Gracias, Eve. Buen día a todas y todos aquellos que nos acompañan el día de hoy. Es un gusto y un honor para mí darles la bienvenida a esta octava edición del SINCA. El evento que está por comenzar y que todos los miembros del comité organizador esperamos sea de su agrado y provecho es producto de un largo trabajo realizado durante el último año, como ya mencionaba Vicente. Un año atípico en el que tuvimos que pensar cómo continuar con este espacio. Sin embargo, fue alentador para quienes conformamos el comité ver la gran respuesta que tuvo la convocatoria del evento. A pesar de las dificultades que seguramente todas las y los analistas del comportamiento que regularmente asisten al SINCA atravesaron durante estos últimos 2 años, hoy, gracias a sus contribuciones, les presentamos un programa nutrido con más de 110 trabajos. Por primera vez en el SINCA estaremos compartiendo nuestras investigaciones durante 5 días consecutivos, durante los cuales podremos disfrutar de trabajos en distintos formatos. En primer lugar, contaremos con 10 conferencias magistrales invitadas, incluidas las conferencias de inauguración y clausura. Estas conferencias las podrán disfrutar al inicio de cada jornada y al final del evento. Dichas conferencias son diversas en distintos sentidos. En ellas participan investigadoras e investigadores de Estados Unidos, Argentina, España, Brasil y México, abordando temas propios del análisis experimental de la conducta, el análisis conductual aplicado y otras áreas afines como la psicología evolutiva. Adicionalmente, dichas conferencias estarán a cargo por primera vez en la historia del SINCA mayoritariamente de investigadoras, lo cual es, en mi opinión, un reflejo de un esfuerzo concreto encaminado a la igualdad de género en nuestra disciplina, y algo que me congratula enormemente. También tendremos 46 trabajos, de los cuales 29 se presentarán de forma sincrónica en sesiones que estarán a lo largo del programa, 6 sesiones. Los 17 restantes se presentarán de forma asincrónica. Este es un formato novedoso para este seminario, pero propio de esta nueva normalidad. Y también tendremos los carteles. En ambos casos, como ya se ha dicho, ya están disponibles para ustedes estos trabajos en la página, así como formularios para que ustedes planteen sus preguntas, así que los invitamos desde ya a revisarlos, a participar con preguntas y asistir a las sesiones señaladas en el evento. A propósito de los carteles, que son la modalidad que tradicionalmente más destaca en el SINCA por su numerosa participación y por la provechosa interacción que propicia, en esta ocasión tendremos 40 trabajos, los cuales también ya están disponibles y veremos en 4 sesiones entre lunes y jueves. También tendremos 15 socios, 4 de ellos invitados, todos en modalidad sincrónica. Como ustedes podrán apreciar, en el programa se encuentran participaciones de una gran variedad de temáticas que seguro serán de su interés. En el caso de la investigación básica, contaremos, como ya es costumbre desde ediciones previas, con temas recurrentes como descuento temporal y autocontrol, ecología conductual, fenómenos post-extinción, forrajeo colectivo, entre otros. En el área aplicada contaremos con trabajos de distintos ámbitos: psicología clínica, psicología educativa, de la salud, del deporte y de educación especial. En total, durante estas 5 jornadas compartiremos alrededor de 200 investigadoras e investigadores de decenas de instituciones de México, España, Estados Unidos, Argentina, Chile, Colombia, Brasil y Canadá. Esperamos que disfruten del evento, que sea un espacio fructífero para la socialización de ideas, resultados y proyectos, y que aunque sea de manera virtual, sirva para reencontrarnos con aquellos viejos conocidos y para quienes apenas vamos a conocer y porque recién nos acompañan. De mi parte es todo. Gracias a todos y todas por estar aquí y cedo la palabra al doctor Héctor Martínez.
Muy bien, pues muchas gracias a todos quienes me antecedieron en la palabra, y lo que me toca a mí ahora es hacer la presentación de la doctora Marta Peláez. Pues realmente para mí es un honor y es un gran placer hacer esta presentación, porque pues a la doctora Peláez la conozco desde hace mucho tiempo, y como ustedes saben, en el SINCA tenemos la política de que nombramos un presidente o presidenta honoraria, ¿no? En cada edición del Congreso. Una vez es a un investigador internacional, no mexicano, y en las otras ocasiones es a una persona, a un investigadora nacional. En esta ocasión hemos decidido por consenso, y no solamente por eso, sino porque sus méritos nos llevaron a ese consenso y toda su carrera, pues a Marta Peláez como la presidenta honoraria del Congreso. Y es muy importante para nosotros hacer este reconocimiento, porque es lo que significa que ser presidente honorario no es ningún homenaje ni nada, sino es un reconocimiento a su mérito académico, ya que su vínculo con México, a pesar de que ella tiene ya muchos años en los Estados Unidos, pues ha sido siempre sostenido y ha sido constante. Ha participado en muchas actividades cuando se organizan aquí en México, ha recibido estudiantes, ha recibido también mexicanos, ¿no? como haciendo estancias, haciendo estudios de posgrado, y siempre que le hemos pedido su colaboración, pues ha siempre sido con una gran disposición, ¿no? Así que, por lo tanto, pues todos esos méritos pues están reconocidos, y es lo que queremos hacer patente, que la mayoría de los jóvenes que pues no han tenido oportunidad de conocer a la doctora Peláez, pues ahora tengan esa oportunidad. Bueno, pues déjenme leer algo de su importante carrera de manera muy sintética, ¿no? La doctora Marta Peláez es actualmente profesora de Psicología del Desarrollo en la Facultad de Educación y Desarrollo Humano de la Universidad Internacional de Florida. Se ha convertido en una líder influyente e importante en el análisis de la conducta a través de su innovadora investigación básica y aplicada con bebés y su dedicado servicio en este campo. Es una de las pocas investigadoras que ha logrado aportar una perspectiva en análisis de la conducta al desarrollo infantil. De hecho, su libro de texto en coautoría con Gary Novak, Child and Adolescent Development, se considera el mejor trabajo sobre el desarrollo infantil con una perspectiva conductual desde el seminal libro de Biu y Baer, ¿no? El Child Development. Además, la doctora Peláez ha sido editora y fundadora de un boletín de desarrollo conductual. Durante 25 años esto fue publicado y se convirtió en una revista de la APA. Una característica notable de su carrera de investigación es su capacidad para tomar los hallazgos de dominios de investigación relevantes, refinarlos y aplicarlos a los problemas del desarrollo. Las investigaciones y los análisis teóricos más importantes de la doctora Peláez incluyen experimentos sobre el apego y la adquisición del miedo. Esto en colaboración con Jack Jewers, de quien ella seguramente hablará y con quien ha trabajado durante mucho tiempo y quien lamentablemente pues hace recientemente pues nos ha dejado, ¿no? Ha trabajado en el desarrollo de una taxonomía de reglas y conducta gobernada por reglas, desarrollo moral, experimentos básicos sobre equivalencia de estímulos con bebés, el establecimiento de contacto visual, vocalizaciones infantiles e imitación vocal, atención conjunta y cúspides conductuales de referencia social como precursores fundamentales del encuadre relacional derivado y precursores del naming, ¿no? Lo que se llama nominación o nombramiento. Junto con Dennis O'Hara y Barnes Holmes, han trabajado en la teoría del marco relacional, que se contacta con la inteligencia, con temas de inteligencia. Más recientemente, la profesora Peláez ha aplicado su experiencia para abordar un problema relativamente nuevo de considerable importancia social, el estrés y la ansiedad, asociados con el regreso a la escuela en la era de la pandemia post-COVID, ¿no? Además de los sobresalientes logros de investigación de la profesora Peláez, es reconocido por su excelente servicio en el análisis de la conducta a través de sus muchos puestos en los consejos editoriales, su servicio en una serie de importantes comités especiales y grupos de trabajo, y su papel fundamental en el desarrollo internacional del análisis del comportamiento. Pues basta decir que actualmente, a lo mejor ella lo dice o no, pero está en los puestos directivos de ABA Internacional, así que pues esta es digamos, una síntesis de lo que la doctora Peláez ha hecho como investigadora. Y pues no me queda más que darle la palabra para que nos dé a conocer su conferencia, y les recuerdo que estamos abiertos a que hagan preguntas a la doctora Peláez, que al final se las haremos para que las conteste. Pues desde ahora muchas gracias, Marta, y es tuya la palabra.
Muy buenos días. Muchísimas gracias a todos, principalmente a la Junta del Seminario Internacional sobre el Comportamiento y sus Aplicaciones por esta invitación. Es un honor, realmente. Y pues estoy muy feliz de estar aquí y quisiera de antemano disculparme porque voy a hacer mi presentación en inglés. Mis diapositivas están en inglés y tengo entendido que este congreso en ocasiones anteriores se ha presentado en inglés. Como dijo el profesor Héctor Martínez, hace unos meses el profesor Jack Gewirtz falleció. Para mí esto ha sido algo muy fuerte porque él tuvo una influencia muy grande sobre mis pensamientos y mis estudios, tanto teóricos como a nivel de experimentación. Voy a leer algo de su historia que algunos ya conocerán. Creo que él influyó en México y fue presidente honorario de este congreso hace algunos años ya. Y esta es mi dedicación de mi plática. El profesor Jacob Gewirtz passed away at the age of 96 on February 12th. Jack Gewirtz was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, and he received his PhD in developmental psychology and experimental psychology from the University of Iowa in 1948. In an extraordinary career that spans almost 70 years, Professor Gewirtz taught developmental psychology at many departments, including at the University of Chicago, at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, Temple University, and SUNY, the State University of New York. He was the director of many programs, but in particular, his contribution in the NIH mental health intramural service for 20 years was spectacular. He moved the field in a very special way. His research and theory interests were in social and attachment of learning, the learning of attachment processes, behavior analytic explanations of imitation early on. And together we did work on moral development and fears and other areas. His depth and breadth of the research and professional accomplishments are likely to be unmatched, I would say, by any other developmental psychologist whose interest is in behavioral science, in particular behavior analytic science. He was a pioneer. I was very impressed whenever he said he was a student of Abraham Maslow, and I say, oh my God, am I so old that my professor was a student of Abraham Maslow? What an honor. And we all know that Maslow was a humanist, so Jack was breadth of influences is very wide. And he was also a professor of Baer, which are familiar, and Professor of Larry Colbert and Claire Paulson, and the list continues. So in a nutshell, I'm very proud of having been his student, and I know that in spirit he is with us here, and he will be very happy to know that I'm presenting some of the early work, but as well that our career was very fruitful, and now we have a very large research agenda on many of the topics that originally he initiated. I have many other collaborators that I would like to thank, and the list is here. Professor Hector Martinez asked me if I could share my talk, and of course I made it available for many of you who wish to read further into the materials. My objectives are three main objectives. I first would like to provide some illustrations, examples of how conditioning methodologies, and in particular social reinforcement, are essential to furthering our understanding of infant social learning. In particular, some phenomena that I'm going to talk about. Secondly, I would like to offer some preliminary procedures. They're procedures that started in the laboratory, but nowadays some of my graduate students and collaborators have already implemented in natural settings, in naturalistic settings like homes. Our research more recently has moved to the area of infants at risk of autism and other developmental challenges. So our goal is to move the basic experimental research findings and translate that to the applied settings. Thirdly, I would like to discuss some of the interventions. I don't have time for all of them, but I will discuss some of the interventions and tactics that can be quickly implemented and effectively implemented by licensed practitioners in conducting their interventions, and particularly with infants at risk of more serious problems. So in this presentation at the end, I hope you should be, as the audience, should be able to accomplish several things. The first thing is to identify what types of infant learning phenomena have been studied, have been investigated. For example, as Hector mentioned, joint attention, social referencing, and other phenomena that I will be talking about. Two, I would like you to be able to identify behavioral markers of infants that are at risk. For example, how do we know when a baby is at risk? What are the main behavioral characteristics or features that we can detect in order to say this baby, this infant is at risk? Thirdly, I would like you to be able at the end of these presentations to tag or to at least mention what are the reinforcement contingencies that have been implemented, that have been studied, and that could be implemented in the private practice, in the applied world. So for example, you could mention contingent touch, that in the ways that we use the tactile stimulation to sustain some of the infant behaviors. And lastly, I know I'm demanding too many things from you, but this is what I would like you to pay attention during the talk. What are the operant responses that have been targeted? In other words, when you begin to design an intervention program, what will be your target behaviors based on assessments? Of course, you have standardized assessments and that for diagnosis that you can implement, and there are many available. for diagnosis of autism. But because we're dealing with infants that are young creatures and they're not yet being diagnosed with autism, we would like to, towards the end of the talk, I would like to talk about specifically how would you target the characteristics of an infant at risk. So, in a summary, what do we know? Well, we know that soon after birth, in particular, we have done also studies with premature babies. And we know that the primary reinforcing stimuli for neonate are feeding, touching, warming up those babies. What else do we know? Well, we know that everything about the caregiver, it's a source of environmental stimuli. It could be a discriminative stimulus for responses that could be maintained by stimuli that is also provided by the caregiver that will be acting as reinforcing stimuli, but among many other things. Auditory, her sounds, her visual, including her smiles, her tactile, her or his, because when we say caregivers, we're talking about fathers as well, grandparents as well. So we're talking about movement, touch, the social aspects of human beings that become evocative and reinforcing for babies for the very first operant responses. There's a lot of research that has been conducted by researchers before me, and in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, we have an incredible amount of research that shows the conditioning of sucking responses, of head turning of the baby, of looking, crying, smiling of the baby, vocalizing of the baby, imitating, pointing, attending. So these are the infant responses that I want you to focus, and that this is what the research has shown us, that these are can function as operant responses. Operant responses is not the only type of responses. We know we don't even use the term operant anymore. But in my talk, I'm going to be referring as the operant in the sense of it's a response that is could be modified, it could be shaped, it could be used as the precursor for other more advanced type of behaviors or responses. We also know that in the more recent literature that the infant learning can result from other mechanisms more than reinforcement. We know that you can form a stimulus-stimulus pairing associations. And in the more recent literature on the stimulus equivalence and derive relations, we know that the babies can also begin to derive relations once they acquire language. That's part of the stimulus equivalence research. And more recently, with Dermot Barnes, I'm very interested in the relational framing or derivative models like framing to attend to substitutional behavior in order to attend to these relations among stimuli that can explain why learning occurs. So, in a nutshell, in a summary, we know that infants' behaviors, the infant operant responses that have been studied and could be studied further include head turning, high amplitude sucking, visual and auditory tracking, when the baby begins to track. And I put my finger here because this is part of the training. Orienting responses. Gazing away is a form of avoidance. Kids learn to avoid stimuli that they don't like very early on, as you know. Kicking response has been used in some of our studies with conjugate reinforcement procedures. Moving away from siblings or others, vocalizing in an attempt to man, tact, or even as intraverbals, grimacing, protesting, tacting a stimulus in a early forms of communication, types of naming and referencing. Here's referencing is one area that I have studied in depth. Social referencing in particular, I'm very interested in referencing and imitation. For further information, if you want, there are a couple, not a couple, there are several, many articles that can provide more in-depth information. But I wanted to make this talk more amenable with combination of informal presentation while at the same time providing you with scientific references that you can always use to enhance your knowledge. All right, so I mentioned the caregiver. I'm going to use the mother and so many examples, but I include the fathers as well as the grandparents and other caregivers, teachers. They are the ones that provide the multiple sources of stimulation, vocal sounds. The baby makes eye contact, they smile, they touch. And also we have a lot of research that talks about reinforcers. So not only the operant responses of the infants, but we know about reinforcing stimuli. For example, we know that by 3 to 6 months, familiar voices and sounds, and I say familiar because the unfamiliar sounds may create some kind of fearful response in the baby. But when it is familiar, parentese or motherese or infant-directed voices could become very reinforcing for the infant's behavior. The caregiver's vocal imitation, like when we imitate the baby sounds, could be very reinforcing as well. Or aversive, depending on the age of the child, the developmental level. Synchronous touch, when it's not intrusive touch, which I did a study, if I have time, I'll show you, where if you provide intrusive touch, it might not be accepted, like tickling and poking. And babies tend to be more receptive to soft touch that is not putting too much pressure and that is synchronized with. They have a way of saying to us how much stimulation they want. And there are procedures, like the synchronized procedure that I coined that name. Carolee Robbie Collier did a lot of studies with memory and trying to assess memory in infants, and she used the conjugate reinforcement procedure. In the arena of social learning, we use the synchronized reinforcement procedure. And I will explain in a moment what that is. But right now, what I want to finish is talking about reinforcers in the sense of socialization, how we can use them. And how can we assess them as well? Because oftentimes we assume, as practitioners, many times incorrectly, that because there are other practitioners that are using a particular reinforcer, like let's say I recommend touch to be used. Oh, well, let's all use touch. Well, that's not the case. Some children might dislike touch. Actually, we do know from research that infants, older children with autism, they don't accept touch very easily. Now, I'm not suggesting that all children with autism don't like touch. No, I'm not suggesting that, but I am saying that we need to be cautious when we say this works as a reinforcing stimuli. We have to always think in terms of individual assessment, individual preferences. Let the individual tell you what they prefer. And if they can with words, there are procedures to assess for that. So in our studies, we show how the social reinforcers can function very effectively for the most part, like the smiles. The smile, you can argue, is it's an original. I have some echo. Somebody to mute their microphone. Touch, for example, can be extremely, as I mentioned ago, it can also be very aversive. And then there are some citations that I make here in terms of mother eats and vocal limitation. All right, so let's move on. The open procedures in our own laboratory, we have demonstrated that, therefore, the attachment phenomenon, the phenomenon of eye contact, infant social reference, joint attention, infant vocalizations, and stimulus equivalence, as well as fear of the dark, and how kids begin to acquire some fears early on. And this is true. I mean, the infants begin, a child who was not afraid of the darks, you know, we as caregivers begin to note, well, why is this kid now rejecting to be alone in a dark room? Why is this kid now reacting, the baby reacting to strangers in a way that before it was not reacting with anxiety and fear to strangers? I want to add that I have another line of research with Dr. Tiffany Field that has to do with infant depression. I'm not going to be talking about depression today because it's very abstract. It's a construct. Depression is a construct, and but it is. There is evidence that infants tend to mimic the mood of the parent. So if a parent is in a depressive mode, we have research that suggests that the infants are behaving in a less active way, sort of mimicking the parent's behavior. If a parent doesn't smile very much, we have evidence, and this is not from behavior analytic researchers, this is mainstream developmental researchers who have shown that there is evidence to suggest that infants tend to behave very much oftentimes like their parents, even though they have their own temperament. So in research that we've done, we're finding that infants at risk of autism, when I say at risk, I mean the following. We mean that these markers that I mentioned at the beginning show minimum eye contact and frequent gaze away, moving away, and reduced number of smiles and high level of fussiness, very limited vocalizations, and definitely there's a lot of evidence on the delay joint attending, sometimes even absence of joint attention between the caregivers and the child with respect to objects. That's what we mean by joint attending the other events, atención conjunta, and the lack of social referencing. They have some difficulty reading the signals that other people present in ambiguous situations to determine how to behave. So an infant may look, a normally developing child by 12 months may look at the parents' facial expressions, and they know, they communicate, they know how to react in that situation, whether it's a dangerous situation or not, whether they should touch a dog or not, whether they should approach this animal or this, if you're climbing a mountain, they learn by looking, but they also learn by listening to the parent. And that's referencing. It's an important precursor for, that is part of our communications. We reference people's signals to determine whether they're liking us or not, whether they reject us. And babies do that too. Babies learn to do that. And infants with autism have difficulty referencing socially these signals. So we cannot put the blame on anybody. This is not about blaming the kid or the parent, but because it's like in my textbook with Gary Novak, we are talking about a dynamical systems approach where you cannot put the weight of the causality in the environment, but you can, which means the parents, you cannot say, well, because you have problematic caregivers and you're going to have problematic children. Not often is the case. We're born with characteristics that make us unique. And these genetic traits interact with our environment to produce individualized behavior patterns of responding. So yes, we never deny the influence of our genes in our behavior. But as behavior analysts, we're interested in behavior, right? And we're interested in the environment. So we need to pay attention to what is the caregiver doing. And we know from research that emotionally inexpressive caregivers, as I mentioned a moment in the area of depression, tend to be problematic for the infant development. If they are in negative mood, babies also learn to be in a negative mood. If the parent is disengaged, it's problematic, because if the parents are attending other things and they're on the cellular phone, dialing or connecting with others while the infant is requesting attention, and the parent is unavailable, obviously this is one phenomenon that we're interested in investigating, as well as if they're anxious and avoidant, intrusive, or if they're behaving non-contingently. Some of our schedules of reinforcement involve non-contingent stimulation. And I know in animal research, I know because I have reviewed many of the posters that come to ABA, and there's very good research going on in Mexico. Excellent. I would say it's among the leading countries in the world, Mexico. Not because I'm Mexican. I'm saying this legitimately. It's unbelievable, the good research is coming from many different laboratories in Mexico. And they all deal, not all, I mean, many of them originally dealt with Schoenfeld's non-contingent type of scheduling. Very important research as well. And when you translate that type of research into human beings, in particular with infants, you find that it's problematic to have misplaced contingencies. Sidney Bijou talk about misplaced contingencies. What is a misplaced contingency? It's when you respond in a behavior that you should not be responding. And I don't mean this from a moralistic perspective, but when I say we should not, I mean, if you don't want to create dysfunction behavior patterns in your child, then there are contingencies that you should be avoiding. I always tell my daughters, I mean, if you don't want that behavior to occur, just pay attention on the alternative responses. The famous DRO, DRA, DRI, alternative responding for replacement behavior. So from the moment these kids are born, from the moment they are there with us, we see our engagement with them in the hospital. We want to talk to them so they can make eye contact with us. And by 2 to 3 months, we know that these babies begin scanning the face. This is research that shows they're scanning the face. You can put a lot of stimuli in front of an infant, but the tendency is to go and look for faces. So that's the natural way of responding, to become fixated on a caregiver's eyes. Later, infants can be diagnosed, unfortunately, with autism, and typically there's a high correlation between the decline in fixation, which some kids may have it, but as we know, some kids who were responding very well in some of these behaviors, when there's autism, many times they stop responding. And that's the worry that many parents have sometimes, that will my child stop responding in the way previously was responding to a name, it was pointing, and now we see it's a lot of gaze away, not eye contact, very minimum smile, and not responding. And this is a concern for many practitioners and for many parents. In our laboratory originally, and I call it laboratory, but we do studies in the natural settings, an adult experimenter is smiling and simultaneously making eye contact. We've shown that can reinforce the infant, not only the frequency, but also in our manipulations, we look at the duration of infant eye contact with a caregiver. And others that we have incorporated to our programmatic research, we find that tactile stimulation, touch, is very powerful. And so when you have babies and you are not only providing the eye contact, but you're also simultaneously touching, it enhances the powerful effect that you have from this social stimulation. In a more specific procedure now, we talk about how do you synchronize this information with what the babies prefer. I talk about the infant's preference, right? So the contingent synchronized tactile stimuli in our manipulations, it was provided by the caregiver simultaneously with smiling, looking, and cooing. Cooing means when you do this, oh, how cute. Parents tend to do that. Even fathers, which sometimes avoid to talk like that to a baby, they do cooing. It's like, oh my God, how cute this baby, que lindo. We say this procedure uses a high tone pitch of vocal sound. Why a high tone pitch? Why do we, when we see an infant, we tend to use this high tone pitch to maintain rates of responding from the infant, which simultaneously reinforce the parental behavior. So whatever the child does, remember, it will also have an impact on our behavior. Let me show you a little video here where we have an intervention. It's just an example of the many interventions where the reinforcement consists of the caregiver's touch simultaneously providing auditory cooing. Oh, nice baby. And the baby is making eye contact with the caregiver.
From the armpits to the fingers, and the fingers to the armpits, so your whole body's connected.
And what we code here, the coding is the frequency of smiling and the duration of the eye contact. Because remember, it's synchronized. It's not a discrete, like, you know, in the rat chamber, you might have a discrete pellet that comes and reinforces lever pressing. This is a different way. It's like here, synchronized reinforcement is like when you're driving a car and you press the accelerator, the car moves. When you stop pressing, the car stops. Here, the baby is, as long as the baby is looking, the caregiver provides the information, or the experimenter in this case. But if the baby gazes away, we stop. The baby reinstates the eye contact, we touch again with the cooing. If the baby moves the head away, we stop. So what we're doing here is allowing the child to determine the preference for what they like. It's not a controlling situation when you say, okay, you have a behavior analyst and they like to manipulate behavior. We are investigating and we let our participants in this procedure, which are the babies, tell us if they like to be touched or not, or if they prefer, what kind of touch they prefer. Here you have some data. Synchronized touch used as a reinforcement for infant's eye contact with a non-touch control condition in an alternating treatment design. So many of you know about the single subject design, and alternating treatment is one of the different kinds of single subject research for science, behavior science. And this particular one started without a baseline, but it had a reversal phase with some extinction opportunities or trials. And what you see here is that overall, in this alternating treatment, when you present one period, these are 2-minute periods, so you present 2-minute periods with the caregiver or the experimenter providing touch while the kid was making eye contact. And then on the next 2 periods, the experimenter does not provide any touch. That's why it says touch versus no touch. And what you could see is that these particular males, that this is a male 2.5 months, very young, and a 2.5, another male, they they responded frequency rate of eye percentage of eye contact, to the caregiver, to the experimenter's stimulation. During the extinction phase, you see a decline completely of eye contact. So that means the alternative was to gaze away. And then, interestingly, what we find very serendipitously, meaning that in science oftentimes you find results that you're not expecting, and those are the ones that you need to pay attention to when you find the things that you don't want to get, because those will be probably the most revealing one. And here you have a lack of responding or differential responding between the two treatments. Now, you can speculate post hoc whatever you want, but which is not really appropriate, too much speculation. But it suggested to us that we need to be careful when we implement touch, because it can lead to habituation, which means the child habituates to responding and stop preferring stimulation with touch. It's like when we say, stop touching me, I don't like that much, you know. There is a limit to how much we eat, as well as there's a limit how much stimulation, physical stimulation we want. So these are all, I think, revealing data that gives you, if you start replicating your results across subjects over and over and over, and you start seeing systematically that you have higher rates of eye contact with one procedure than another, then you begin to suspect, well, maybe I have something here, which suggests that when we introduce synchronous touch, we can get higher rates of responding. Now, not all infants will probably respond the same way, but for the most part, 11 infants here in this procedure show the same results. Now, we have other studies with 12 infants in this case, where you compared poking and tickling versus rhythmic touch. And overall, the mean, first because we did some statistics, you calculate the mean, not the median. So we did ANOVA's analysis of variance, and we find significant results, difference between the intrusive type of touch and the rhythmic. In this case, the infants prefer the rhythmic over the intrusive type of touch that were provided by the experimenter. So in conclusion here, in this area of my presentation, we do have different types of individual vocal topographies, the cooing, the babbling, the echoic responses, the first words, and then you have to look at the behavioral function of it. Well, we said, what is the behavioral function of this? Is the baby mending? Is the baby tacting a stimulus? And this is now what moves us to our next area of research. In addition to moving basic to apply interventions, now you begin to find that you can use the synchronized reinforcement procedure not only to increase eye contact, but to increase other types of responses, like the verbal responses. So we use typically a recording for coding, iPad, and a camcorder. As you can see, the camcorder allows the researcher to record exactly where they're looking, and then you can measure the gaze of the child, as well as you can record the units of a voice and the different types of, whether it's an echoic or a pure imitation. In the apply settings, we have parent training, and typically we have written instructions first, in vivo modeling next, a role playing by the experimenter, plus providing feedback. And then this is in vivo plus feedback. So we have a stepwise type of parental training where the parents master a particular criterion for achieving, understanding, and performing. In the case of mother is or parent is, or as well, is defined as director. We also have combined that, one of my students, Jackie Carroll, combined that with to maintain eye contact. So now it's not just maintenance by touch, but let's try vocal stimulation to evoke infant eye contact, but then to maintain it. So one thing is the evocative power of the stimulation as well as the reinforcing power. What you have here is originally a child with a baseline of, in this case, of eye contact, very minimum eye contact. Once the treatment was implemented, it acquired reach criterion for the last 4 sessions. These are short 1-minute sessions. This is just an example how you can conduct research with small units of time, and then you can accumulate many subjects, because these kinds of training, the babies learn extremely fast. They're fast learners. So there's no reason to spend months and weeks trying to implement a reinforcement procedure. If the baby are going to get it, they'll get it in a few minutes. It's like Gottlieb would say, you know, Gottlieb, he would say, you know, that oftentimes these creatures learn very quickly and almost innately. It's built up in us to learn. And then the last phase, we reinstated the treatment after a small extinction phase, going back to baseline. And replication stress after replications is important. This brings me to the line of research where you compare now. You're using the single subject design with control procedures to compare different types of simulation. So you can compare the motherly speech or parentee speech using the alternating treatment procedure with vocal imitation. Why do we need to compare? We need to compare in order to determine which is the most effective intervention that we can make recommendations. A lot of practitioners are implementing treatments, but they're not based necessarily on research. We as parents tend to imitate a lot of our infant responses. So we tend to imitate the motor. If the baby claps, we go and we clap because it's so funny to us, right? It's cute. If the child vocalizes, we not only laugh, but we tend to imitate. In the case of vocal imitation, if that's your target behavior, you can increase target behaviors of infants at risk, as we're going to see in a moment, by using melodic rather than monotone voice, rhythmic voice, and one sound that contains elongated vowel sounds. So by 1.5 months, babies react to engage more readily in these kinds of speech. For example, let me give you a 2-month-old male. I have baby females and males in my samples. Happens to be that these were males. The mother is responding contingently with vocal imitation to the infant vocalization. But what I want to point here, very importantly, I think, or funny, is that that's why we need to pay attention to what the infant is doing, because this baby is correcting the mom. And maybe you can interpret this the same way I did. I saw this day a few times, and then I began to realize, why is this baby correcting the mom? The mom is not doing the procedure correctly, all right? It's not doing it correctly, but the baby is sort of bring her back in track, like do it right. Now she's doing. So what you saw there towards the end is that they enter into the synchronized mode, right? The contingent treatment was in another study. This is a large sample study because you have 48 and 50 group designs where you have the bar indicating the significant group differences as well as the comparison of during baseline, during the contingent response treatment, during the non-contingent response treatment, then going back to contingent response, and then non-contingent response. I mentioned the non-contingent literature that's going on in Mexico a while ago. Well, what you can see here is the schedules of non-contingent compared to contingent, and using these kinds of social stimuli as reinforcers. So basically, the most effective in this particular group design was the contingent responses. If you look at the black bar, that's the parentese speech, like cooing. Oh, what cute! And the vocal imitation is the white bar. So the contingent overall for the mean, the contingent is slightly bigger, but they both work more effectively when there are contingent than when there are not. And some of our, I know replication is tedious, but that, as Maurice Sidman would say, replication is necessary, direct replication as well as systematic replication of our finding over and over and over, because that's the only way that you can conclude. So we have studies by some of my graduate students that have been published, Boroto, Caro, Haley, Namey. Many of them have done replications, and it's just amazing to me how the same finding comes back over and over and over. You have greater effects. This is not one study. These are dozens of studies that show contingent vocal imitation producing the larger effects compared to the non-contingent vocal stimuli. So there's something there to say about the role of contingencies on our human behavior, especially very early on with infants. Why do we study infants? Not because they're cute and nice and, oh, Marta Peláez likes to study babies. Yeah, I love babies. I mean, I have a lot of grandchildren myself. But what attracted me to the research with infants is that even though there is a learning history from the moment we are in the womb, we're learning how to kick, and our moms and our dads touch the belly, and we have the contingency possible there. We're creatures that at birth have less history, less contamination, so to speak. So we can study these creatures, babies, in the lab with less history to control. That if you bring an adult that is already suppressing all the repertoire, and it's extremely hard to know what is the mediator role of the history in the performance of this adult. I mean, there are procedures to avoid that, or not to avoid it, but to control. And you can do different manipulations on your baselines and your control procedures that will allow you to some extent being conservative, to make some assumptions, but research is never pure. And to claim that I have unique results and this is great, it will be invalid, because we human beings are very dynamic, and there are many influences in our behavioral repertoires. And the more I begin to think about this in our dynamical systems approach, the more I realize that we have very limited power on our predictions, although it's better to have some predictions than none. In this type of research designs where you have A, B, C, D, E, all kinds of combinations, you have baseline intervention, then you move to a control phase of non-contingents, go back to another treatment where now we use Spanish as type of motherese, and then you go back to a control phase, and you can go on and on. One of our other students, this is in progress, Elisa Valle, is doing a study where she was very interested in comparing the role of Spanish-speaking parents versus in Miami we have well, community in many languages, not only Spanish and English, but we have families that speak in French and English. And sometimes we have families where they speak 3 languages. In my own family, we have English, Spanish, Hebrew, Japanese. So we alternate consistently between one language and another. And I thought this was very important. We thought this was very important to compare how the infants react to these sounds when they're given in different languages. These are some of the results, preliminary results of this research, where you have the parentese in Spanish versus parentese in English. And it's pretty similar. Again, we go back to the role of contingency, which is replicated here. And in this particular case, we got better results. We're getting better results with Spanish because somehow if the parents are of Spanish origin, then the motherese works better in the language of origin. So I'm going to be moving towards the last part of my presentation, which I'm going to be talking now about some of the infants at risk, more seriously at risk, because they're already showing all those characteristics and being assessed formally. In the parent training model, in the natural environments, to look for generalization of their response. We call them, in this particular case, infants at risk because they, unfortunately, in the family, there were other kids already that were seriously, they were showing problematic behavior. And by problematic behavior, I mean communication, lack of communication, lack of social behavior, and in general, their cognitive developmental scores were very low. So we have an 11-month with very low language and communication scores, and parental request for intervention regarding the levels of communication from this baby. Another 9-month-old that is diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, with low language and communication and low social behavior, which are the 3 main areas, you know. And by communication, I mean beginning with eye contact, following developmentally with joint attending, that is attending the same object, that's the parents, and referencing, which means responding to cues provided by the parents in environments that are ambiguous or dangerous or unfamiliar to the child. And the third participant in this case is an 11-month living with, these are names that are made up to protect the identity of the infants, 11-month. At-risk infants, sibling diagnosed with ASD, with already also delayed motor development, delayed language development, and parental concern. So these are parents who are eager to get interventions and to teach them, which is, in this case of this line of research, is how to conduct the sessions in the client's home, to administer 2-minute trials with breaks in between, and then use the alternating treatment design to implement these 3 different conditions. So we have in this particular experiment, the design is alternating treatment, and the 3 treatment variable conditions, control conditions, are the contingent motor speech, the contingent vocal imitation, and the non-contingent. Again, I cannot emphasize enough that the non-contingent responding, which is, what is non-contingent responding? I want to say this to not the savvy researchers that are behind, that are in my audience today, but if we have parents listening, what we mean by non-contingent responding is a responding that is not synchronized and that is independent of what the child is doing. So the child is on the phone and then suddenly there is a delay responding that the child cannot capture is with respect to his or her previous behavior. That we, in some experimental manipulations, we know that after 4 to 6 seconds delay, you can have almost enter into the territory not only of delayed responding, but of a non-contingent response. Because from the child perspective, that is totally unrelated to what they were requesting or saying. So it's like if a light starts coming on and off independently of our responding, that environmental stimuli is non-contingent on our turning on and off the switch of the light. And so that is at the core of the mechanism that promotes human behavior, is the aspect of the contingency. Now you can call it operant contingency or you can call it different types of contingent stimuli. This is one of the babies that had autism, and the findings here show that vocal imitation was much powerful with this baby than the motherese or parentese speech as compared to a non-contingent responding control condition. You have a preceded alternating treatments preceded by a baseline. The same thing for this other baby. This is another study conducted by NAMI, Jonathan Tarbox, Peláez, myself, and others, including Kat Monlux, which is one of my strongest collaborators today. Here, I'm going to take 5 to 10 more minutes to wrap. I want to tell you about joint attention. Do I have 5 minutes?
No. 5 minutos, Marta. 5 minutes.
Perfect. Very good. I'll make it in 5 minutes. No, 5 minutos y termino. Quiero ir a referenciación social, dado el tiempo limitado que tengo. La atención conjunta, joint attention. What is joint attention? It's the ability to use, again, eye contact and gestures to both, to initiate responding. And what is the function of joint attention? The function is, it could vary. It could be pointing to, the child may point towards an object that wants to share with the parent. It might show to share. You might want you to have that object, like when they're eating food and I want you to eat it and they put it in your mouth, right? Or engaging, just so you can come and play with them. And there is research by Per Hall and others that have demonstrated that, as well as Kat Monlux, which I mentioned a moment ago, has done a terrific study on this. There is like everything, we have a paradigm, a model to explain the, try to explain. I don't claim anything. I think we just trying to explain things. And well, you have a establishing operation. What is an establishing operation? Many of you do know, but it's a condition that enhances the efficacy of the contingency. So if you are providing a novel stimulus, the kid might be curious about that novelty, and it might shift the gaze between the object and the novel object and the adult to look for cues. So I'm looking my parent for cues. Now it's different than referencing, because in joint attention, the parent may not provide cues, but it might just play, share, or join, the activity. Whereas in social referencing paradigm, and I'm going to skip this part about the study, I just want to show the model of referencing. In referencing, the presence of the ambiguous stimulus is an establishing operation, but then the signals that the parent gives will become discriminative events for what to do in the situation. So for example, in an ambiguous situation, the infant referencing means a child looks to the parent may present a smile and reach for that object, animal, let's say there is a snake, the kid may even try to touch the snake. And the consequence is that the actual consequence in the environment is that that snake will be playful. Nothing will happen to the child. It's quite reinforcing, actually. But in the negative trust, if a child, let's say there's ambiguous object, something is hot in the kitchen, the kid reference the parent because see the smoke. The parent says, no, don't touch that, it's hot. And the child goes and touches the stove. That burning now becomes a consequence for the child not following the cues of the parent. So when the kid learns to follow the cues of the parent, there are going to be always consequences after, if it's parents with coherence. There are parents that are, in reality, there's some parents who are incoherent and they don't provide consistent cues for any of the child responses. So that's when you deal with difficult parenting for us, because they need to learn how to respond in congruency with the environment. And so we condition in our original studies this arbitrary cue signal, which was meaningless originally, and this was meaningless. And in a condition discrimination procedure that many of you may know, and I started this research with Jack Goodworth's original, we provided a paradigm to try to explain how it is that a smile is a smile and cues to the child that when something, this is a laboratory preparation with a puppet theater that presents objects to the child. And you can read more about this in the literature that Dr. Martinez is going to put on the web. But a fearful face might also, the kid learn that is not a good thing to do when my mom makes a fearful face. So these are all studies, again, that are backed up by data. And with that, I want to just say that it has expanded now to the social referencing has expanded in two areas of research. One is with apply settings, which, well, not even apply settings, basic research with children with autism or at risk of autism, and social referencing. It's hard to do social referencing with children with autism, but it's possible. And then the next area of research, it's going to move to perspective taking. What is perspective taking? We're beginning to associate this because it's developmentally seen. And for that, we need a lot of referencing and joint attention and all the developmental precursors. And with that, I want to just conclude that three things shortly. Social reinforcement, eye contact, touch, smiles, mother-ease or parent-ease, talk, vocal imitation. All of these seem to be powerful stimuli when implemented contingently. That further research that you do, I encourage you to try it. Always social reinforces better than, in my view, than tangible things. We are very social creatures and we respond very well to social stimuli. And in particular, if you don't have a laboratory, you're doing naturalistic interventions in a home environment, you can do these kinds of procedures safely because you're using the same stimulation that they receive all day long. And we need to see about the role of fathers as well, and multiple caregivers adopting children. And I'm very open to grandparenting as well, because I'm a grandparent myself. And with that, I want to leave you. That's my website. And thank you so much, all of you, for being here with me and for joining this fantastic seminario. Es un congreso increíble y felicidades a los organizadores. Gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, doctora Peláez, por tu conferencia. Y vamos a destinar un poquito de tiempo para algunas preguntas. Tenemos unas cuantas preguntas que voy a empezar a hacerlas, ¿no? Hago la pregunta y tú respondes, ¿vale? Va.
Okay, sí.
Dice, esta vez está en español, te lo voy a hacer en español. Creo que lo puedes entender, ¿sí?
Claro.
Dice, hay estudios con infantes con deficiencia auditiva en donde no hay la correlación entre sonido y contacto visual o cutáneo, ¿no? De la piel. Y de haberla, ¿cómo difiere de los que sí escuchan?
No hay correlación. ¿Puedes repetir esa parte de la pregunta? No hay correlación
entre sonido y contacto visual. Es decir, cuando hay una deficiencia auditiva, según entiendo, cuando hay una deficiencia auditiva no hay una correlación entre el sonido y el contacto visual, por ejemplo, ¿no?
Pero eso es una especulación muy grande, porque hay estudios que siguen la línea de Gibson, de J.J. Gibson y Eleanor Gibson, y estudian la percepción intramodal. Y lo que han encontrado, ellos no vienen de la perspectiva del análisis conductual, pero sin embargo han encontrado que, por ejemplo, tú puedes ocultar un objeto, hacer que los bebés lo toquen, y a través del tacto pueden identificar el objeto que están viendo. Ellos utilizan un método que le llaman preferencia visual. Entonces, hay una integración de los sentidos, auditivo, visual y tacto, donde no podemos descartar el hecho que desde el nacimiento ya estos sentidos están intramodalmente integrados. No sé si eso responde a la pregunta, pero si es más allá de lo que respondí, no desconozco. No sé cómo podría pasar eso.
Ok, ya, bueno, esperemos que sí. Hay otra pregunta que dice, ¿qué quieres decir cuando tú dices que los padres instintivamente imitan a las vocalizaciones de los niños, de los infantes?
Definitivamente no creo que sea una palabra muy difícil de entender. A mí tenemos respuestas que son reacciones a nuestro ambiente que pues llámalas como quieras llamarlas, instintivas o no instintivas, pero son innatas. Los reflejos, por ejemplo, en el libro tenemos una tabla de categorías de todos los reflejos que tenemos al nacer, que son respuestas que ya vienen con nosotros. Es la respuesta de Babinski reflex y todo. Estos son, llámalos instintivos o reflejos, son respuestas que nosotros tenemos. Por ejemplo, una madre protege a su infante y lo protege con un instinto de protección.
Muy bien. Creo que ya quedó claro lo que había respondido en la anterior. Bueno, al menos la respuesta está hecha. Otra pregunta, ¿qué piensas de la teoría de los marcos relacionales aplicados al desarrollo infantil? ¿No? De relational frames y esas cosas.
A mí me parece que ya era tiempo para que el análisis conductual empezara a tener algo de progreso, porque siento que el análisis conductual está muy estancado cuando nos limitamos exclusivamente a entender que el comportamiento se aprende solamente a través del reforzamiento. En este caso, vemos claramente con todas las demostraciones que ha tenido que, al igual que otras líneas de investigación que no solamente son los marcos relacionales, que hay una emergencia del comportamiento a través del lenguaje que no está limitada a aspectos solamente del reforzamiento, sino que son derivados en una forma cognitiva a través, y es que aquí da miedo decir palabras como de mediación, de cognición. Yo no tengo ningún problema con hablar de derivación a nivel de pensamiento, o sea, tú estás derivando aprendizajes nuevos por aprendizajes ya aprendidos, y los marcos relacionales son marcos que nos permiten entender cómo es que derivamos estos nuevos comportamientos, estos nuevos aprendizajes, por decirlo, sin necesidad de reforzamiento directo. Entonces estoy muy a favor de todo eso y espero que se expanda y que se estudie más la sustitución de los estímulos para poder empezar a entender un poco la conducta.
Ok, Marta, muy bien. Una última pregunta que es cortita. En tu opinión, ¿la gente aprende a imitar?
La imitación hay dos tipos, por lo menos. La reflexiva, que es al nacer, y la aprendida. En sí, por supuesto, la imitación generalizada creo que ya la imitación generalizada es aprendizaje. No, aprendizaje en el sentido de que es el resultado de interacción con la retroalimentación que ocurre del entorno. Si el niño imita y hay una retroalimentación, hay un feedback que viene del entorno, pues continúa imitando. Pero si no hay ningún tipo de cambio, posiblemente esa imitación deje de existir.
Muy bien, Marta, pues muchísimas gracias. Creo que con esto damos por concluida esta conferencia y la sesión de preguntas. Les recordamos a todos los asistentes a este evento que estas conferencias van a ser grabadas y posteriormente se van a subir a la página de del SINCA, ¿no? Y va a estar disponible para que si alguien se perdió alguna parte o quiere volver a ver o quiere fijarse en alguna referencia, pues va a estar disponible, ¿no? Ahora vamos a hacer una pequeña pausa y vamos a volver con lo que está marcado en el programa, que son 3 sesiones simultáneas, ¿no? Que tenemos dos de tipo de comunicación sincrónica y un simposio, que tenemos un simposio, entonces a las 10:45. Entonces les vamos a pedir que salgan vayan al programa en la página y accedan, ¿no? Por la vía que está ahí marcada. Muchísimas gracias, Marta. Ha sido un placer, un honor, ¿no? Que hayas colaborado y participado con nosotros y que pues te recordamos que eres la presidenta honoraria de todo este congreso. Muchísimas gracias a todos y nos vemos en un momento.
Gracias.
Hasta pronto.
Gracias.